Good morning. I'm Dan Mazur. I am a partner in the Technology Transactions Group at Mayer Brown, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. I have what sounds like a very sexy title, the Big Data Paradox. And I guess we could take that a lot of different directions, but today I want to focus on a paradox of particular importance to the people in this room. As Brad pointed out earlier, big data is top of mind for virtually every company. And over again, you hear companies say that data is one of their most valuable assets. In fact, I believe it to be true. But are companies really treating data as one of their most valuable assets? It's axiomatic that if you're dealing with data, that the rights you have in that data have to be aligned with the manner and purposes for which you're using it. It's also critical that you be able to manage to those terms and that you be able to demonstrate that you are in fact complying with them. In our experience, however, far too often companies are not giving data the attention it deserves. And to paraphrase at least one commentator, you can quickly go from a data lake to a data swamp. So the opportunities presented by data, as well as the risks associated with it, multiply almost daily. Data scientists are finding new forms of data, new ways to use it, new opportunities presented by it. Business teams are looking at new ways to derive value from data. We are looking at new types of data that are emerging almost daily, and we are looking at new sources of data. Think about IoT, mobile devices, social media. We have all of these new ways to derive data. And perhaps most alarmingly, the regulators are now scrambling to find ways to take old regulations and apply them to a very new business paradigm. Perhaps this is the reason why in a recent survey of business leaders, the single biggest impediment to big data that they identified was data governance. Think about that. These are business leaders who say, when it comes to my big data strategy, the single biggest challenge is whether or not I can govern the data. So if you think that intellectual property rights are the way in which to deal with all this, as Brad told me earlier, stole my slide on this, in fact, that doesn't work at all. Their data is not entitled to intellectual property rights. It's not given copyright protection. It's given very little narrow trade secret protection. At the end of the day, the critical piece is getting the contract terms right. Companies obtain data through many, many different contracts. Most of them aren't labeled a data license. They have all kinds of, it's employee agreements, sourcing agreements, joint venture agreements, lots and lots of different contracts. Some of them are highly negotiated and have great thought put into the terms, but too many of them aren't really given any attention at all, and they are just signed without any real thought given to where will this data land and how will it ultimately be used. From a compliance standpoint, the simplest thing would be if you took all of the data that you got from a single source pursuant to a common set of contractual terms and you put it in a single database. Think of this as the fortress approach to data governance. Build the walls high, put it under lock and key, let only a few people get in and only if they have the magic password. From a compliance perspective, this is brilliant. It does everything you want. From a big data perspective, it's a disaster. It diminishes the value of the data. You can't use it in the ways that the data scientists and digital teams want to. You're not able to combine it with other data. You're not able to draw conclusions across a broad swath of data. So what are companies doing? Instead, they are creating intricate webs of primary databases, secondary databases, data warehouses, and you have data flowing freely across the entire enterprise. Great from a big data perspective, terrible from a compliance perspective. Now, if you were in a point where you had a comprehensive, consistent set of terms across all of the data that you license, this wouldn't be an issue. We're going to come back to that later, but that's not what most companies have. Most companies have a hodgepodge of data subject to different contractual rights. Now, what you could do is literally tag every piece of data with the source of the data and the terms applicable to it. And that's theoretically possible, but that's not what companies do either. And even if they have some evidence of where it came from and what the terms are, it's lost as it moves from database to database. And the danger, of course, is that someday there's a knock on the door and the auditor's there to look at all of the ways in which you're using the data, and you find that it's in multiple databases being used for purposes that far exceed your rights in the data. That's not a theoretical possibility. That's happening today. Data licensors have become much more aggressive in pursuing this. The other challenge is even keeping track of data is hard. You know, it's not like software. Software has a software fingerprint. It often reports on its own use. Data is not like that. Even finding all of the places where the data resides is very difficult. And so it becomes not only difficult to manage it, but it becomes virtually impossible to demonstrate that you, in fact, are complying in the event of an audit. If your answer to this is to say, this isn't my problem, the data scientists and the data strategy teams, they should be doing this. They're the ones who are coming up with all of these ways to use data. Why shouldn't they have to figure out whether we have the rights? Think again. Their job is to find new ways to use data, to derive value from data, to come up with ways to advance the business. Their job is not to find data licenses and look for things that will restrict their use of the data. Doesn't make them bad people. That's not what they do. And so it is going to fall to the legal, procurement, and compliance professionals, like the people in this room, to be able to handle this part of it. Let's talk about just a few of the common data licensing issues that we run into. Users. When you're defining who can use the data, seems like a simple enough thing, right? Often remember that a license is signed by a single corporate entity in the family. Does that mean that the affiliates can use it? What about the contractors that you all employ to do things for the company? Do they have the right to use it when it's a license granted just to the signer of the license? What about the bots that Brad was talking about? Machines that are performing the same functions that were previously performed by individuals. And by the way, they're performing, let's say, 10 times the volume of the individuals. Do they count as 1 or 10? What about customers, to the extent that's relevant to the way in which you're using it? How about location restrictions? It's amazing how many licenses are restricted to a single entity or a single facility or even a single machine. You can run it on one machine. What about virtually all of you are using, for one reason or another, offshore resources? Can your offshore resources access it? Can it be stored and processed offshore? Too often these issues aren't addressed at all. The purpose. Again, many licenses, there is a specific purpose for which the data is provided. It may be for a know your customer check or an application processing or a claims processing or tax compliance or some other very specific purpose. Too often, again, if the data ends up in general databases where it is being used for a broad set of purposes, consistent with your business, but not consistent with the purpose for which it was given. term and termination. Again, data is often licensed for a specific term, and the expectation is at the end of the term, you will either return or destroy the data. Well, we've already talked about the fact that what's the likelihood you'll even be able to find all of the places where the data is located to be able to return and destroy it. But if you're a bank or an insurance company or another regulated entity, the likelihood is that you can't return and destroy it. Take, for example, a New York law governing insurance companies. Insurance companies are required to keep all of the data that they used for every underwriting and pricing decision they make about a policy until 6 years after the policy is no longer in effect. That could be decades. You can't just give back the data, even if you could find it, at the end of some arbitrary term. What about the rights that, is the licensor, do they possess the rights to give you to use the data in the way that you intend? Remember, they're often third parties who have gathered this data from other locations. Even companies you're dealing with are providing personal data from individuals that you will never have contact with. And so how do you know whether they have the rights? How do you know whether they've given the appropriate consents or notices to the individuals? How do you know whether they have the appropriate consents from the individuals? You need to build that into the contract. That's your protection, is reps and warranties, that in fact they've got the rights to give you what you think you're getting. At this point, I'm sure you're thinking, this guy's been talking for almost 15 minutes and he has yet to say data privacy or data security. The most important words apparently from every, and the answer I want you to know is not because I don't think those are important, because they obviously are. I personally think we have a national obsession with data privacy and data security. That's not a bad thing. It's really important that we focus on it, but it's really important that we don't focus on it to the exclusion of everything else. And so rather than focus on that, which many other people here will, I want to focus on something which, again, is far less sexy, but which is not getting enough attention among companies. So, as the people in this room, the legal, compliance, and procurement professionals in this room, what do we do? What do we do next? So, one, you have to actively participate on the data strategy team. You can't sit back and wait for them to call. They won't call. I hate to say that to you, but they won't. They have a job in life. They're doing all of the cool stuff. They're the ones who are coming up with all of these exciting ways to use data. The last thing they want to do is go look for data licenses and try to see all the things they can't do with the data. You have to be at the table to raise these issues. And as they come up with increasingly novel ways to use data, it's going to raise new issues that you're going to have to be at the table to deal with. Two, let's think about what do you need to do from this point forward to make sure that in the future we're not having the same conversation. Okay, from this moment forward, every data license you do, and remember, many of them won't be labeled data licenses, every one of them needs to have a comprehensive, consistent set of terms that are aligned with the ways in which you're not only using the data now, but the ways that you expect to be using it in the future. Some point in time, you need to do that because that's the only way you can be confident that the data, no matter where it lands, can be used for the purposes that you want to use it. And you don't have to be concerned about which database. You don't have to be concerned whether it's in a fortress or not. As part of that, I think it's important to go back and if you don't have data license terms, to create a template, a form that you can use going forward. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to always use your form, but even if you aren't able to use your form, it's a useful checklist of what is it that we've decided has to be in our data license terms going forward. I got one more 2 minutes. All right, what about looking backward? You've got hundreds, thousands of data licenses behind you. As painful as this sounds, I think there is no way to get around it. You have to go back and identify them and review them and risk score them. I understand that even finding these and collecting them is a mammoth undertaking. And for that, I apologize, but you have to do it. You need to be able to gather it. You need to come up with a way to identify the key terms in it. You need to hopefully put it in a data collection form that is standardized and searchable so that you can quickly get your arms around what's out there. Then you have to take it and risk score it in the sense of, all right, I went too far. You have to risk score it, so in my mind, it will come into one of three buckets. There will be a bucket that you say, I can live with this risk. This is old data, it's being used less and less. The half-life of data, at least some data, is very short, and it may be a risk that you just decide, I can take this risk. There will be a second group where you say, okay, the risk is greater, but I don't want to go back and reopen each of these agreements. I'm going to wait for my opportunity when I have some leverage, whether it's amending the agreement, extending the agreement, replacing the agreement. I'm going to know that that's on my plate to do, but I'm going to wait for the right opportunity. But there will be a third group of those where the compliance issue is more serious, the potential exposure is greater, and we're going to have to come up with a strategy to actually address that issue in real time. Bolstering data governance. As we talked about, data governance is hard, and yet most companies don't really have a program to focus on data governance. It's important to put in place the measures to both monitor and track compliance and be able to manage compliance. And that requires that you put in place governance processes, which I suspect you don't currently have. So be focusing on that. What are we going to do to make data governance possible? There will be issues that come up. Be prepared to investigate them. Don't let them fester. I promise you they do not get better with age. But at the same time, do the investigation in a legally privileged manner. Don't wait for the data trolls or the regulators to come knocking. At the same time, don't give them a blueprint that they can follow to exactly what the issues were that you had to address. Finally, and if you walk away with nothing else this morning, walk away with the thought that big data requires that we be able to do data governance, and being able to effectively govern data requires that we give a lot more attention than we historically have to what are the terms on which we get data, how are they aligned with the ways in which we're going to use the data. It requires more attention. It is much more important. It has to be treated as a high priority, critical document, critical set of issues, and given the attention it deserves. Thank you.